spend a little bit of time going through the syllabus to let you know what you're getting into and saying a little bit about the books as we go along. I will say up front, I made a trade-off on the course. There's a lot of reading. I don't apologize for that, but the trade-off is there's not as much writing as it could be. So it's a little bit less writing, a little more reading, because I think reading is probably more important than writing for this course. The purpose is basically straightforward. It's just to introduce different kinds of topics within Christian moral theology, and with a particular emphasis on formation of the Christian moral imagination. In other words, what forms you? Because we see in the world what we look for. So what as Christians should we be looking for in the world when we think about ethics, when we think about moral theology? The expectations is your completion of the assigned readings, completion of the written assignments, and regular attendance. Now, I don't take roll. You're adults, and it's your nickel. But I have made this observation. Those students which tend to attend the most frequently usually write the better papers. Just as you get kind of break the rhythm of when you start skipping classes. One thing we will be doing this year is video recording the lectures. They will be posted after the course. So if you need to refer back, or if you happen to miss a course, you can watch the rerun. Are they going to be on Netflix? Probably not.
No, not on Netflix, no. Maybe Hulu Plus.
Pardon?
Maybe Hulu Plus.
No, that's not going to happen either. And in a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit more about how to read the text and how to do the writing. There will be 4 essays, the first, second, and then the paradigmatic essay, which is about 50% grade. And again, we'll talk more about that. Today is kind of the introduction. We're going to be looking at St. Augustine, a little bit of Alan Verhey, and Iris Murdoch. And we primarily spend a good part of today housekeeping chores, just getting how the class format will work and what's expected. We will then, beginning next week, look at the background of Christian moral formation. And what we're going to be looking at is late modernity and the emerging technoculture. Now, there's a lot of different backgrounds we could have chosen, but the reason I've picked the technoculture is because technology is ubiquitous in the world in which you and I live. We really can't escape it. It's everywhere. And the question that we have to ask is, how is this technology shaping us? And how is it going to be shaping the people you're going to be working with when you go out, either in a parish or another kind of setting? Because, just to show you a difference in what we take for normal. When I was a university chaplain, say 30 years ago, if a student had come up to me and said, I call my mother 30 times every day, I probably would have said, you have some issues. We think nothing of texting a person 30 times a day. It's now the norm. But does that particularly begin to shape us in a different way, the parent-child relationship, particularly as the child becomes an adult? We don't know. But we need to be cognizant of how technology is forming and shaping us. For example, I bet none of you write drafts anymore. Right? You have documents that you constantly edit. But in previous generations, we wrote drafts. And you think differently when you write a draft as opposed to editing documents. We also just read differently. When you read something on a backlit screen, you tend to read in L patterns. You don't read the complete text. So again, having a generation growing up with backlit screens, their brains are literally formed different. So we need to be cognizant of what's going on in the emerging technoculture and how it's shaping and misshaping us. Throughout that section, if you haven't already read the novels, and that's when we'll begin reading Ishiguro, Remains of the Day, because that's a story about formation. And against that background, we'll be then looking at Shirley Turkle, in fact, next week. She has been at MIT for over 30 years and has written a variety of books on the effects of technology on young adults. And her latest book is really an assessment of particularly information technologies and how they affect young adults and teenagers. Then the week after that is when you really need to start bucking up your courage, because you're going to be spending time with that troubled philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. And the reason I'm having you read Nietzsche is not to endorse him, but simply to say, if you want to understand latent modernity, you have to make your peace with Nietzsche. He saw what was coming, and he saw it with great clarity. You'll then read George Grant's Timeless History, which is really the assessment of Nietzsche from the standpoint of George Grant. George Grant was a crabby Canadian philosopher who was actually trained in theology but never taught it. He taught primarily political philosophy after getting his first job. But it's interesting, hardly anyone's heard of him in America, but he was well known and regarded in Canada, particularly for a book called Lament for a Nation. He wrote that shortly after one of the parliamentary elections against the Kennedy administration, in league with certain interests in Canada, voted the Conservative government out of office because the Conservatives refused to allow Americans to place nuclear weapons in Canada. And George Grant wrote the book, Canada No Longer Exists. It's a lament for a nation, and this is what prompted him into fame. And we'll also be recommending in that one another piece that he writes on Nietzsche, Technology and Justice. The following week, then, we'll look at Grant again in terms of the question of the justice of technology. And then Albert Boardman. Boardman is a philosopher who teaches at the University of Montana. He's a devout Christian and has written quite a bit on how do you both engage and resist an emerging technoculture. And we'll be talking about things like focal things and practices. That's really what is it that commands or should command our attention and shape our lives, so that the technology simply just doesn't rule and dominate us. Then we'll also be looking at my book on From Human to Posthuman. Are you familiar with posthuman proposals? Heard the term? Okay, virtually what it is an attempt to reshape human beings in something to be better than human. So that, for example, there's a quest now for immortality. It's thought that maybe you can do that biologically, you can tinker with the genes, you can stop the Xerox effect so that when your genes replicate, or when they replicate, they don't shorten the telomers. And therefore, in principle, we can create immortal beings, or virtually a great extent of longevity. If that strategy doesn't work, there's the cyborg option, the cybernetic option, in which you start combining artificial with the body. So, for example, you might design a better heart, or long-lasting skin, whatever you need, or augment the brain. And if that doesn't work, then there's the prospect of virtual immortality, in which it is assumed that the information that constitutes your identity can be reduced to zeros and ones. You upload the digital information into a computer and download it then into robotic or virtual host. So again, the backup disk, virtual immortality. Now, whether or not this technology is technologically feasible or not is really not the issue. The issue is, are we beginning to think that we already are becoming posthuman? Which is really to say, we're artifacts of our own will. We are what we make ourselves. And we begin to see that language reflected in common vocabulary of remake. We have lifestyles. We reinvent ourselves. And that really begs some interesting questions from the Christian tradition, in that do we own ourselves? Are we our own possessions? Or to the contrary, we have a different understanding of what it means to be human. From there, then, we'll go from the background into the foreground of Christian moral formation. And in terms of the themes, we'll be looking at scripture and ethics, worship and ethics, doctrine and ethics, and in pastoral counsel and moral judgment. And in each of those readings, again, the two novels that I want you to be reading during that section are by Mary Lynn Robinson. She works at the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa. Gilead was a award winner, Pulitzer Prize, and Home is the sequel. And it's a story about two ministerial families in a small town in Iowa. And it's really a retelling of the prodigal son. But again, we'll be using that fiction to begin to get at and saying, okay, how are these people formed and how are they not formed? Now, each of those, and then in terms of reading and scripture and ethics, we'll be looking at Verhage. You'll be spending a lot of time with Verhage, and you may refer to him as Uncle Alan. It's such a wonderful book because unlike most of the other books that you'll be reading are what I call in-your-face books. I mean, they're really trying to pound home an argument for you. Verheyen's approach is much different. It's like, please, be seated, and let us talk of many things. It's a very different approach. But Verheyen also has a profound way of putting together scripture, doctrine, and the different things we'll be looking at, particularly scripture. And we'll be looking at our own Professor Cosgrove's book on ethics and scripture. And then for that class session, Professor Cosgrove will be making a cameo appearance to talk about scripture and ethics. Then from there we'll go to worship and ethics. We'll be looking at a collection of essays put together by Professor Anderson on the topic. And that day, Professor Anderson will also be making a cameo appearance and talking about worship and ethics. Then we'll move to doctrine and ethics. We'll be looking at Jones' book on embodiment, which is Beth Gutler Jones. It's a very important book, I think. And she teaches over at Wheaton. Evidently created quite a stir at Wheaton because of the book. The students at Wheaton wanted to have the rules relaxed to allow more dancing on campus. And the administration was resisting. They invoked Beth Belker Jones' book on embodiment, saying dancing is a bodily activity, ergo dancing is a good thing. And they couldn't refute their own faculty member. So she survived the controversy, but nonetheless, I think it's a very good book on that topic. And we'll also be looking at Stephen Ray's book on Do No Harm. And Professor Ray will be making a cameo appearance to talk about doctrine and ethics on that day. And finally, we'll move into pastoral counsel and moral judgment, looking at some essays that Laurent Schultz and I put together. Laurent teaches over at Norwegian University, and these essays really grew out of a conference that we had here at Garrett a few years ago. And on that day, Professor Hogue will make a cameo appearance to talk about the relationship between pastoral counsel and moral judgment. And one of the things I need to say up front is I try to blur the line as much as possible between pastoral theology and moral theology. Reason being is that I think most pastoral situations usually have a moral component. And most situations of moral judgment also require some type of pastoral care along with it. So those two are distinct disciplines, but they overlap, and the lines should be blurred as much as possible. Then finally, we go into the spheres of moral discourse, deliberation, and discernment. And we'll be looking at three in particular: economics, healthcare, and politics. For economics, again, we'll be looking at Verheyen and Schneider's book, where he's basically going to try to convince you that it's good to be affluent from a Christian perspective. And what he's going to say is that in the absence of affluence, lives suffer, both in terms of both the beneficiary of the affluence and the indirect benefit of it. Healthcare, and also in terms of economics, we're going to be looking at it from the standpoint of globalization. Again, the global economy is something which is inescapable. If you're in a small parish, in a small town in Nebraska, those wheat farmers are not competing with farmers in Kansas. They're competing with wheat farmers in Ukraine and throughout the world. And you need to have some understanding of how global markets work and what both the benefits and what the liabilities are of a globalized world. Particularly, we're going to be asking the question throughout that section: is globalization good news for the poor? We'll then turn our attention to healthcare. And again, healthcare is something that all of us are either going to confront firsthand or secondhand. Particularly those of you going into pastoral ministry, you will spend an awful lot of time in hospital. And you need to, again, have a basic vocabulary of how do I think about healthcare from a Christian perspective. For example, undoubtedly, most of the issues that we'll be looking at will be issues at the beginning and end of life. Those tend to be the questions that really attract the attention of bioethics, and everything in between, except for funding, doesn't receive much attention. But at the beginning of life, you may have to help parishioners think through, or people in the hospital context think through questions like, let's say you have a couple that come and say, we are both carriers of cystic fibrosis. who both have the recessive gene. That means there's a 1 in 4 chance the child will be born with the disease, a 1 in 4 chance that the child will not be born with the disease nor carry the recessive gene, and a 2 in 4 or half chance that they will not have the disease, but they will still carry the recessive gene. Now, it may be then that it is suggested they go through a process of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, in which you go through in vitro fertilization, you screen the fertilized eggs, the embryos, and only select those that are free of the condition. And they will ask the question, is this permissible? Or increasingly, we might face situations where insurance carriers will say, since you both have the recessive gene, you have to go through this process, or we won't cover a child born with the disease. Again, we need to start thinking through the ethics of that. Or at the end of life, you may have to help people think through questions like, my 85-year-old mother has terminal cancer. It's expected she has a few weeks, maybe months to live under a great deal of pain and medication. She's currently in the hospital. She has contracted pneumonia. Should we treat her? Doctor says we don't have to. So again, we have to think through. And that doesn't, it's not as cruel as it sounds. It used to be called, pneumonia used to be called the old man's friend, because it was a much quicker and painless death than other forms of death. Then finally, we'll be looking at the always entertaining topic of politics. Again, visiting Verite, St. Augustine, City of God, Book 19. I'm assuming you've all had church history, so you know something about the good Bishop of Hippo. And this is probably his greatest book. And in Jean Beth Elstein, we'll be thinking on the limits of politics as an Augustinian, from an Augustinian perspective. And she teaches down at the University of Chicago, at the school, and commutes from Nashville. You will then have a vacation to engage in the customary week of something far from fasting, more like perpetual feasting and overindulgence, culinary delights. And then you will return and write the paradigmatic essay. And we're going to work on that for 2 weeks in terms of workshops of just concentrating exclusively on how to write that essay. Okay? And helping put together a topic. We'll be working with each other, working in small groups. And then after that, we don't meet on the 17th. That's when the essay will be due. So any questions on the format? All pretty much straightforward. Okay, reading the text. Actually, you should read each book twice if I was really doing this right. Now, why do I say that? Because your first read should be a charitable read. Understand what the author's trying to write. Come to a knowledge of that. Then give it a second read, which is the critical read. That's when you start complaining, arguing with the author. Now, as you get more and more skilled, you can do both reads at once. But you need to read every author both charitably and critically. Otherwise, you might miss something. I mean, there's nothing worse than criticizing an author for something they never wrote because you weren't careful enough to read it charitably. Authors make enough of their own damn mistakes. They don't need other ones put upon them by bad reading. So a charitable read is really for understanding, to really get that. And how do you do that? On every chapter, get the first paragraph down. That's the promissory note. And everything else is delivery. Even if you have to spend time paraphrasing that first paragraph through it, it's well worth time because everything else then makes sense. And then secondly, read the book in the most boring location you can find. Make sure the book is the only interesting thing in the room so that there's no distractions. And turn the phone off and turn the computer off unless you're taking notes, but then close your phone. And I'm serious about that. Theology is not easy stuff to read. and it doesn't help when you're constantly being distracted. So, and if both of those strategies fail, then lock yourself in the room, point to the book, and say, only one of us is really good. And have it out with the text. But it's important to stay up with the reading. I think it's the students that get in trouble are the ones that get behind in the reading. So it's important to stay with the reading. Okay, questions on that then on the reading? Okay, writing the essays. The most important thing you should do at this moment is expunge any thoughts of creativity. Be creative will simply get you in trouble. Just straightforward essay. Because the purpose of the essay is not to show your creativity, but to exhibit a familiarity with text, their primary arguments, and related topics and issues. Think of it, writing an essay as a bad attempt at a conversation. Because that's really what we're doing, is we're trying to help each other understand the text, the things that we're reading and thinking about. You are forbidden to have titles. In other words, each assignment will simply have 3 or 4 questions. You choose one. Just list the question and then answer it. Now, there's 2 reasons I've forbidden titles. Is that number 1, students started spending an inordinate amount of time coming up with clever titles that then had absolutely no relevance to the essay. So that was always a bit of a bewilderment. Secondly, if you've ever noticed, the titles of papal encyclicals are the first 2 or 3 words of the first sentence. So if it's good enough for the Pope, it's good enough for you. Okay, just do that. Just no titles. Okay. Just answer the question. Now, the paradigmatic essay is really an opportunity for you to put things together. You will draw on resources from this class, but you will also draw on resources from all the other classes that you have taken that you think are relevant. And again, you'll be given a question to answer, some options to it, and it's just answering the question. There's really a way for you, because the problem with any educational system is that it's based on silo. So you've got Bible silo, you've got history silo, you've got theology silo, and your practical disciplines. And rarely do you get a chance to put things together. Okay. Think of this then as an opportunity to do that, as a way to really start honing your skills, because when you're out there working, you're going to have to put this stuff together somehow. You can't tell a person, well, from a biblical perspective, I think this. From a historical perspective, I think this. From a moral perspective, I think this. You're just simply going to have to put it together. So this is an exercise in that process. And I know it sounds hypocritical for me to say this, but try to have some fun with the paper. There's nothing worse than trying to write a paper that you are bored with. If you as the author is bored, think the reader will be. So try and take some chances. Take some risks when you're writing a paper. The reason being is because I have an unlimited rewrite policy. If you get a grade you don't like and you want to raise it, resubmit it. You don't have to rewrite the entire paper. You simply reply to the comments on the paper. And you can keep doing this as long as you want until the arc is irrevocably closed at the end of class. If you have that right. And if you are given a grade below a C-, we will require a rewrite. Now, if you get an A the first time, I would strongly urge you not to submit the rewrite. Because then you're simply playing the tape. Okay. But again, it's just simply keep. The reason being is this. When you're out there working, it's not that you always have just one shot. You keep working on things until you get it right. Same thing in the classroom, same thing with any kind of academic enterprise. You keep working at it until you get it right. So you don't have unlimited time, but you do have at least an opportunity to do the rewrites in the class. Now, the paper should all be submitted electronically. And we've had some chaos with this in the past, so I want you to do it this way. When you submit then you've got a file. It's last name, first name, and either SA1, SA2, SA3. That way it just makes it a lot better when we're organizing the papers. Would be great. Okay, my beloved TAs, do you have any other words of advice?
Me first. One of the things that has been, I think, a significant struggle over the course of, this is my fourth time now taking this course, is the thesis statement. Even if it's a one-sentence answer to the question that you're working on at the top of the essay, so that it's clear in your mind what you are writing. I would recommend doing that and running that by one of us at the beginning. That way you have a clear idea what the rest of the paragraphs ought to be doing. It has not been uncommon to not be able to discern a clear point of the essay in the first paragraph or two, and that becomes very difficult to grade. So as an initial, and I would say constitutive element of an A essay, that is critical.
And there's no taxes on transition sense.
But there is on adjectives.
There are adjectives,
Yeah.
tax and adjectives.
Yeah.
If something's good, it doesn't have to be very, very good.
So one of the ways that I have talked about writing transition sentences, I assume most of you have made a sandwich at some point in your life from a loaf of bread that has been sliced. Have you ever taken a piece from the middle and one piece that's like closer to the end of the loaf of bread? And what happens? Do you have a nice, like, neat sandwich, or do you have like this ugly sandwich that lacks any sort of aesthetic value as food? Right? So if you take the pieces next to each other, you get a much cleaner sandwich, a much prettier looking sandwich. The same is true in your writing. So if you can get those last sentence and the first sentence of the next paragraph looking like a nice loaf of freshly sliced bread, you've got a much easier time of convincing me you've written a compelling essay.
All right, so I guess what I'm going to say is quite similar to what William does. That I guess when I'm looking at the essay, I'm looking for at least two things. One is, there are always a topic that you want to discuss. I'll be looking for what others have been saying about the topic and what you are going to say about the topic. So I'm going to look for both of that. I'm interested in what you say about that, but if it's just what you're saying, then it makes me think, wonder why you say that. So I'm looking for both of that. And the other thing is that besides the transition sentences, sometimes I wonder, why why someone say one sentence after the other one. I would kind of lost. So I'm looking for, why you say this sentence after that one. So what's the logic of them? It can be surprising, sometimes I get lost with what I read. And so my native language is not English. Sometimes it makes me wonder, if it's my English or what. But I believe that, if you make it flow, then it's much easier for me to understand what you're saying, and much easier for me to not get frustrated and give you good grades. I guess that's the thing.
Yeah, and don't try to play the game of what you think Miller, Wong, or Waters would agree with. It's not whether we agree with you or not. It really is the paper arguable. That's really what we're looking at. Whether we agree or disagree is irrelevant in terms of that. Also, in terms of just a straightforward, it's like, let's say I ask the question, you choose this one, is God love? Well, you could answer yes for the following reasons, or no for the following reasons. and it's lining up in 3 reasons why. You could also say, now, it may be objective, but I don't think the objection holds because of the quality. It's always, think of sentences as begetting sentences. Okay. Just always think, and always have each word carry as much weight as it can. So, again, it's really straightforward writing is just the best way to do it. The problem with most student papers, even like some doctoral students, I'm not students